Hello, everyone. This is Keith Stone with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and we're here for another Cosmos Society online open house. And our guest today is Richard Martin, Professor of Classics at Stanford and longtime associate of the Center for Hellenic Studies. Let's see. I like to ask people, Richard, how they got interested in classics for the first time. What first inspired them? Do you have a memory of that? Was there a specific moment, or was it just always part of your life?
Well, I was thinking about this the other day. I think when I was about 4 years old, I was addicted to a cartoon called Hercules. So that was probably the first inkling that this stuff was out there. And it's interesting that it was a hero story. But, you know, I grew up in an Irish family in Boston. We had this house, like a Chekhovian 19th century house. Grandparents, granduncle, everybody all in the same big house, and stories would be told constantly. So I think it's even earlier than my encounter with Hercules cartoons. It goes back to just storytelling from the time I was born, probably. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, I got to do Greek and Latin in high school. It was fun and easy, and I kept doing it. So that's why I'm here.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I like how you say you got to do Greek and Latin in high school.
Yeah,
I don't feel that way.
We had to do Latin, and Greek was, we were teased with Greek as this kind of exotic lace, as I think Dr. Johnson called it.
Thanks. So you're going to talk with us today about the Medea and ideas of hero or heroine cult specifically.
Yeah, and so thank you for the invitation, because it's always wonderful to talk to this elite cadre. And I know that you've been immersed in all of these texts. And so I wanted to try out ideas on you rather than, you know, it's not a lecture at all. It's much more workshopping some ideas, because I have been interested lately in the relationship between cult on the one hand, by which I mean regular annual religious ritual or worship, and on the other hand, text. And I have to say that even text is a misnomer, because we're dealing with classical tragedy, you know, which is a performance event. These were not designed to be read, although even Aristotle thinks you can get a lot out of tragedy just reading it. These were designed to be seen and experienced one time, kind of consumed artifacts, maybe 5,000 people. Perhaps 10,000 people. There's still debate, as you know, about the number of people who could fit into the theater of Dionysus in the 5th century. So this is an event that we're looking at in 431 BC, an event that unfortunately lost out to the other competing tragedies. This was it got third prize, 3rd out of 3. And it's something of a miracle that we can talk about it, you know, around the world in 2018 as a text, but it really originally was an event. So as I'm thinking about this event of the Medea, I have to think, well, what's in the head of the audience? You know, if I could reconstruct the sort of hive mind of the 5th century Athenian theater audience, what would it look like? And of course, we can't do that in great detail, but at least we can do a kind of odds up as if experiment. What if they knew about various things? Would that change the way in which they experienced the event of the Medea, the drama? And maybe drama is the best way to name it. Drama, as Aristotle reminds us again, is not an Athenian word, but it means doing. And so this was a doing, an action. What significance did this particular action, these particular words, have for all kinds of Athenians? And I'm assuming that the audience did have women, maybe had children. I don't think that we have to imagine only male elite citizens watching this play in 431 BC.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask one quick question? Yeah. Richard, you were saying how this is an event, and I think that you said meant to happen only once. We know that later these plays were put on again as kind of reruns, you might say. But so these were just, you'd see it once, it's got its prize, and then it might just have, disappeared, kind of like Super Bowl commercials. You see them once and that's it. I mean,
but they're on YouTube forever after. But that's a good question, because I think there's one example of a play somewhat later, The Frogs of Aristophanes, which is 405. And we're told that the Athenians liked this one so much that they got a kind of special one-time only exception to re-perform it the next year. But I think in the genre of drama, at least, the assumption is this is going to be consumed. I like the Super Bowl analogy. Now, to play the devil's advocate, you might point to the poetry of Pindar, which is concurrent with the earlier tragedies. He's actually a contemporary of Aeschylus. And it looks like the poetry of Pindar has sort of internal setups that will make sense in re-performance, because he talks about the poems being forever heard and re-performed. But I don't think that we have any indication that the Athenian tragedians thought that would happen.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, you were talking about the mind of the Athenian audience.
So the mind, or maybe the universe of discourse, is a more neutral way to put it. So how do we reconstruct this sort of thing? Well, we rely on all kinds of information, whether it's from inscriptions, what we know about tragedians themselves is sometimes interesting, where Euripides comes from, and Sophocles, all the sorts of things that frankly were kind of illegally or ruled out of bounds in new critical discussion of drama, and new criticism, which was the idea that you just take the text and you don't think about biography or history. New criticism actually dominated classics in this country, probably from the 1950s up until the 1980s, 1990s. So maybe I'm reacting against my own new critical tendencies. The sort of things that we can bring to bear on Medea involve information about Medea that doesn't necessarily come from literary texts. And it turns out that there are a number of pieces of information about Medea out there. Now, some of them are in the form of marginal comments that have made their way down through history, probably going back to scholarly works of the Hellenistic period, maybe even to the 3rd century BC. Some of the information comes from that wonderful source that you all know about, Pausanias, who in the 2nd century AD made a tour of Greece and wrote a long series of books covering, especially valuable for us, Corinth and Athens. So Corinth, which of course is the scene of the action, had a number of religious monuments and religious events, ritual events, that I think are relevant to the whole story because they relate to Medea. And so what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the idea of the hero, and then, to telegraph my punch, suggest to you that Medea is the equivalent of a hero, that she is a heroine, not just in the sense of the protagonist of a drama about Medea, but in the very grounded ritual sense of a being who is worshipped every year by a community. Okay, so far? So stop me if there are any questions even at this point. Okay, so in a nutshell, what do we know about this being, the heros, or the hero, in the beings which are somehow between mortal and divine? Well, we know that people like, and I'm saying people in a very loose sense, Odysseus, Achilles, Oedipus, Agamemnon, Menelaus, all of these, of course, are featured in the poetry of Homer and in Athenian drama, but they had a kind of extra literary life in the form of heroes. And the hero is essentially, very roughly, something like a Christian saint. Why do I say that? We know that they were the object of veneration, yearly sacrifices, libations, at a particular spot, which was usually identified as their tomb. Even Oedipus, who you think would be the last possible candidate for hero, if we're thinking of something like the CNN heroes, people who get selected for doing great things for their community, Oedipus, the parasite and incest, would seem to be an unlikely candidate, right? But even Oedipus, as we know from Sophocles, Oedipus at Colonus and other sources, has a tomb, has a cult, and is basically a protective divinity for the local area. And when we know with Oedipus, just to take that example one step further, there was a dispute between Thebes, where he had been king, and Athens, where he ends up, as to who's going to get the body, because the body has this kind of talismanic power attached to it. So the ultimate example of the hero in that usage is, of course, Heracles, who has hero shrines all over the Greek world. He wasn't just the possession of one city-state. And heroes are good essentially because they are powerful, dead creatures who exert power even beyond the grave. You can pray to them. You can invoke Heracles. You can ask for help. They can battle disease. They can keep away your enemies. They're a kind of localized divinity, a kind of God in the ground, if you like. So if you're with me so far, and again, what I'm giving to you has been expressed much more elegantly by my Dr. Vater Greg Naj in The Best of the Achaeans, we're used to this notion of the hero as a ritual being, as a daimon, a power for good or for harm, dead but still somehow alive. That also can be transferred to the heroine, the heroine, and we know that there are at least 400 heroines known to local communities in Greece. I'll give you a couple of examples. Iphigenia, who's associated with the cult of Artemis, especially in Brauron on the east coast of Attica. But even people like Penelope have annual worship attested. We get that from Pausanias. Is Medea one of these? That's the question. How would we know? Well, what's the evidence look like? And here I turn to the first bit that I had on the handout, which comes from a fairly late source. And if you want to see a longer analysis of this passage, it comes from a piece by Sarah Hitch, which is on the CHS website, and I give you the URL there. Sarah's writing about the 3rd century BC poem called the Argonautica. It's an epic poem written by Apollonius of Rhodes. We've got the whole thing still surviving. And Apollonius is really interested in a kind of antiquarian way in hero cult. So Sarah, whose quote you have here on the screen, talks about some of these events in the poem where Jason and the crew bump into heroic beings. There's the catalog of heroes and the story of Caeneus. Caeneus is this sort of a guy who's seen it all because he started life as a woman and then he got turned into a man and then he finally got hammered into the ground by the centaurs. That's a whole nother interesting story, but he's essentially an underground hero. There's Heracles. You can read about that in Sarah. Now I'm working my way down. There's Orpheus, another huge story that we could talk about at some other point. and his underworld experience, the katabasis, the going under the ground. Further examples, and now I'm quoting Sarah, of blessed afterlives are demonstrated to the external audience in Hera's prediction, and here's the kicker, of the marriage of Achilles and Medea in the Elysian fields, traditional abode of the blessed. So there's a story out there that not only does Medea live on in some afterlife, but she gets married to the ultimate Brad Pitt of ancient epic, Achilles, in the Elysian fields. You like that? Have you heard that one before? It's a little weird. It is like one of these celebrity magazine imaginations, like, let's pick the most unlikely couple in the world, the hero of the Trojan War and Medea. And they're going to hook up in the Elysian fields after, well, after what? Because this is the question. Achilles dies, we know that. Medea, there's no story about her death. So is she transported there to the other world, the Golden Ages place, the Champs-Élysées? We don't know. We do know that Achilles was worshipped as a hero in the area of the Black Sea, and a multi-form of that story is the one that you're looking at, that he lives on in the Elysian fields, he's still alive out there. And you can see how stories like that are a projection, in the case of Achilles, of the actual facts. For our community, he's still alive because we call on him for help, we worship him, we bring him libations every year. In effect, he's like a living saint figure or saint sinner. So the syllogism for me is this: Achilles has hero cult. Achilles is imagined as living in the Elysian fields after death. Medea is imagined as being in the Elysian fields. Therefore, does Medea have heroine cult? That's still going to be the question mark, because as we move on, you'll see that there are tantalizing pieces of evidence, but nobody ever comes right down to it and says, and we worship Medea. Okay, so that's the als ob, the as if part of my experiment. If we scroll down a little bit, you'll see the actual bit of Apollonius Rhodius that Sarah Hitch is referring to. And it's a funny little dialogue when Hera is talking to Thetis, and she says to Thetis, the mother of Achilles, when your son comes to the Elysian field, out an Elysion perionte osvios iketai, he whom the naiads are now tending in the dwelling of Charon the centaur, though he longs for your milk. So Achilles is imagined as this little kid who's been outsourced to the centaurs and the naiad nymphs, and Hera is projecting his career to Thetis, his mother, okay? And basically saying, then you've got to get back together with his father too. When he comes to the Elysian field, it is his fate to be the husband of Aeetes' daughter, Medea. Creo mencures possum emanai aeetao me de es. Creo. It is a needful thing for him to become the possis, the husband of Medea, daughter of Aeetes. And you know, Aeetes is in turn son of the sun, S-U-N. Okay, let me pause at this point and see if there are interventions that you'd like to make.
Anybody?
Yeah,
go ahead, Bill.
So, yes, I'm interested to see where this discussion goes on whether Medea had cult or not. The logic that she was married to Achilles in the Elysian fields, so maybe she did. She's one of 8 women who have the title of Mrs. Achilles in the underworld. So, Polyxena, the Trojan princess, she's one of the possible wives in the underworld. So if Medea has, I don't think she has any cult at all, but that'd be something interesting to see it. you're married to Achilles if you eventually get a cold.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So Polixena, for example, do we know anything about what people do with Polixena in memory and in ritual? Offhand, I don't know. I would run to my Geoffrey Gant's early Greek myth or to Farnell's cults, but and I won't ask you to name the other 7 wives of Achilles, but
well, you know Helen's one of them, right?
Huh?
You know Helen is one of them.
Oh yeah,
Helen is one.
Okay, well that's a great example too. If I might, play my hand a little bit more. Helen, we know for sure, has cult right. in Laconia and in some other sites in the Peloponnese. So in effect, the syndrome is at work there. And there's a whole discussion of whether Helen was originally a goddess and so forth. And my former teacher, Lowell Edmonds, has done a big book now about Helen, in which he takes on some of this thoughts of Helen as goddess, Helen as heroine. But thank you. Can I? Well, let's hear if there are other people who would like to intervene at this point.
I've got a quick question. Richard,
yeah.
You mentioned 400, at least 400 heroines who are worshipped. Who made that list? Is that an ancient list, or is that a modern dissertation who, someone tracked down all of these?
It's at the very bottom of the handout, and okay. It's a funny collision. For hundreds of years, nobody had made the list. It wasn't an ancient list, although if you look at Hesiod's catalog of women, many of these figures do come up in the catalog of women. And so I'm thinking the catalog of women is a kind of handy guide to heroines of the ancient world. Deborah Lyons had been a dissertation student of mine and of Froma Zeitlin's at Princeton, and she did her dissertation in the mid-90s. Gender and Immortality is the book that resulted from it, Heroines in Ancient Greek Myth. And I think she has the entire list in the back. But at exactly the same time as Deborah was doing this, Jennifer Larson also came out with a book, Greek Heroine Cults. So, for millennia, we had nothing. And then all of a sudden, within 2 years, we have 2 big books on the heroines. So I recommend those 2 at the further reading. 400 heroinae compared to probably 900 heroes of whom we have names. It's still a pretty good proportion given the treatment usually accorded to women in the ancient sources. Okay, so let me circle around, if I can, at this point and try another mode of attack. And I realize this is all tentative. It's me trying out ideas, and I love it when you push back. If we can't say that we have exact evidence for Medea cult, it is interesting that there is a cult of Medea's children. And you probably know the story that it was only in Euripides' Medea that Medea herself killed the children. And the story goes that the Corinthians, who had been accused of killing Medea's children, after Medea took down Glauce and Creon, the Corinthians came and either stoned or slew Medea's children. And those are the stories we have from other sources. So the anecdote is that the Corinthians actually paid Euripides 5 talents, which is a huge amount of money, to write a play in which they would be absolved. It's not them. We Corinthians didn't do it. She did it. Look it's Medea. That tries to explain why only in the play do we have Medea actually doing the dirty deed. Whether or not that's true, and having worked on Aristophanes, I think it's not impossible that there's some monkeying around like that going on. People can get at playwrights and have them do stuff. Whether or not that's true, let's turn to the end of the Medea and see just how the hero cult for the children is described, and then look at a few other pieces of evidence about the children, and then circle around again to Medea, okay? So I'm looking at lines 1378 following, and the translation that I've got is, let's see, slightly different because I'm using Kovacs's Loeb at the moment, just so that I have the Greek at the ready. Jason says, "Give up those dead to me to bury and lament." And then Medea says, "No, I'm going to bury them with my own hand, taking them to the sanctuary of Hera Acraia." This is a sanctuary that is on the outskirts of Corinthian territory. It actually would take some doing to get there. It's what we now call Perachora. And by car from Corinth, it takes you a good 45 minutes, I would say. So in a way, she might be threatening to take them to a place that Jason's never going to really be able to easily go and sort of remind himself of the kids. Whether or not that's the point of Hera Acraia, she's going to take them to this precinct related to the goddess of marriage, Hera, which is ironic, so that none of my enemies may outrage them by tearing up their graves. So there's the practical reason for getting them out of downtown Corinth. She doesn't want the people of Corinth to rip up the tombs of the children. And Kovacs translates, "I shall enjoin on this land of Sisyphus a solemn festival and holy rites for all time to come in payment for this unholy murder." That's a test tube case of hero cult, where you compensate the people who are dead by a continual festivals and holy rites in payment for this unholy murder. Well, she doesn't mention the fact that she murdered them, and somehow the Corinthians are going to be the ones to make it up to them. Semnein heortein kai tele is the word for ritual, pros apsomen, taloipon anti tude dus sebus phonu. It's interesting that Semnein, which means the august or holy feast, is compared within two lines to dus sebus, the same root, sebus, meaning having bad veneration. Seb is the root of semne. So the murder is dus sebes, and the heorte, the ritual, is the opposite, semne. And then I myself shall go to the land of Erechthea. She's going to leave town. She's put together this deal with Aegeus in Athens. She's going to live with him. Eventually, she's going to almost murder another child, Theseus, the child of Aegeus, but that's all to come. Okay? And as for Jason, he's going to get hit on the head while he's lounging underneath the ship that he once used, the Argo. A piece of it's going to fall off and hit him on the head, and that's how he's going to die. Wonderful stuff, right? The children, therefore, get cult, and we're told that right in the poem at the very end, as often happens in Euripides, where you have a kind of etiology of ritual. There's another excerpt, and now perhaps we can read number 1 children excerpt, having to do with the children's cult. Let's see. Is the screenshot there?
Let's see. Should be there. I think it's the next, maybe the next PowerPoint slide.
There you go. Perfect, perfect. So this is the Scholias, the medieval commentary that goes back to ancient sources that gives us a little more about this ritual. And so the Scholiast in prose, the comment on these lines says, Medea is talking about establishing a city festival, Pandemon Heortein. I'm using here the text from Corinne Pash, in their honor, in which the Corinthians will celebrate them. Enhe panegyrisusin. It's the same word as in modern Greek. They're going to have a panegyri, an all-together gathering. Panegyrisusin. Thuusi de autois. They will sacrifice to them, not just the Corinthians, but even the Argives, in accordance with an oracle. Okay, so far, that just expands on the kind of catchment area for who's going to worship the children of Medea. And we're not talking about Medea yet. Since the Corinthians were suffering from a famine, the god ordained them to honor the children of Medea. I, therefore, she says, shall establish a city festival in their honor. Now, that's a new twist. In the poem, Medea says, I'm going to set up the festival as a kind of quid pro quo, reciprocal compensation. The scholiast has this idea that once upon a time, the Corinthians on their own were suffering famine, and they decided to honor the children of Medea. Now, it doesn't make clear whether there had already been a ritual and they just had neglected it and they had to get back to it and go to the tomb and honor them. The word for honor is timesai, to give time to. And we know this is a regular way of describing hero cult as well. You give time to the hero. But it's an interesting diachronic view that not only is there the original establishment of the ritual, there's a kind of reuse when they're suffering from famine. And who knows why the Argives started sacrificing to them. An oracle told the Argives. That's also typical for when you have cult already. The oracle will say, oh, you know, you should go to that cult site and do what you haven't been doing. Okay, so far? So let's move on to a little bit more evidence on the children's cult before I circle back, as promised, to Medea herself. Here's another late text, Philostratus, another second sophistic, 2nd century AD, which is a wonderful text I think you probably have encountered already. It's a story of a visitor to Lemnos, the island, who meets up with a local guy there, a vine dresser, and the vine dresser has these kind of mystical encounters with the dead heroes of the Trojan War. So he knows all about what goes on in the other world. The vine dresser says, since you're willing to listen to my stories, what the Corinthians do to commemorate Melicertes, this is another sad story of child killing, for these are the ones I meant by Sisyphus's descendants, and what they do for the children of Medea, whom they killed to avenge Glauce, are similar to a dirge that is mystical and ecstatic, right? Treno ekastai telestiko te kai enteo. Telestiko is literally having to do with initiation. Medea's children, they attempt to appease. Melicertes, they praise. So two interesting additional facts here, and typically you have to piece together this kind of evidence to get anywhere with hero cult. We know that the Corinthians in this view are the ones who killed the kids to avenge Glauce. And we know that later they, through ritual, because that's the context for both of these, Melicertes and the children, melisontai, they make more mild. They attempt to appease is the way it's translated. So this is not just having a famine and then going and giving sacrifice at the tomb. It sounds like the children really have agency and they're causing bad things to happen, whether it's a famine or something else, we don't know. They're kind of like the Erinyes, the Furies, the beings who are put underground in Athens in yet another instance of bad stuff being neutralized. The Furies at Athens after pursuing Orestes, end up in a trial in Aeschylus's Oresteia. We get the whole scene. And they agree to go underground as kind of divinities that can hurt and harm. They were originally Erinies, and they become Eumenides, literally the good-minded ones. In effect, they are appeased by the Athenians. So that's the view I'm getting of the children of Medea. They're like mini Erinies. One more on the children. So let's go to Pausanias. And this is really the biggest chunk, I think, that we have. And he's wonderful. You can just take Pausanias in hand and try to follow him. I think you might get run over if you try to follow him on the Corinthian road these days. But you can imagine this is the road which leads to Sicyon. And he sees a temple and an image of Apollo, and then the well of Glauce. The beautiful thing is that every spot in the landscape has a story. They say that Glauce, remember, she's the daughter of the king who's getting burnt up by the cloak, in the belief that the water would be a cure for the drugs of Medea, threw herself into this well. Okay, no more on that story. Above this well has been built what is called the music hall, beside which is the tomb of Medea's children. Now, this is obviously not the sanctuary of Hera. This is someplace else on the road to Sicyon. Pausanias knows the names of the kids, Murmurus and Pheres, and he too has the story that it's the Corinthians that killed them because they brought the burning cloak to Glauce. But as their death was violent and illegal, the young babies of the Corinthians were destroyed by them. Yet another twist on the story, right? The dead babies of Medea, or young guys, are basically cursing the Corinthians with a very appropriate reciprocal death of children. So the Corinthian mothers were not able to sustain the lives of their own kids after the death of Medea's kids, which was caused by the Corinthians. Okay? Until, at the command of the oracle, yearly sacrifices were established in their honor, and a figure of terror was set up. And the figure is still there, he says. The new settlers broke the custom of offering those sacrifices to the sons of Medea. So this is the Romans who come in and don't know anything of the local traditions. But we hear from Pausanias what the old tradition was. They had sacrifices, and the children cut their hair and wore black clothes. Now, as Corinne Pash and others have pointed out, this has all of the markings of an initiation cult for children. They cut their hair, they wear black clothes, and the story behind it is that they're doing this in honor of the children of Medea, who never really made it to the age of initiation. So again, the human community compensates for the sufferings of the hero. The hero in this case are those kids of Medea. Where's Medea in all of this? Nowhere, because she's not even said to have been the one who killed the children. She indirectly caused their death because she caused the death of Glauce. The Corinthians stoned the children because of that. That's as much as I want to say about the children. And let me pause and see what your reactions are.
So I always got a reaction. Just tell me to shut up if I talk too much. There's a lot of, obviously, as you've demonstrated, there's a lot of conflict on how the children died, and who killed them, and all the details. There's even stories that they died in the ensuing fire when the palace went up. So the question, everybody agrees though they died. Such dead heroes usually only have their influence is only for the local area. It's not like, they're causing curses over in Athens. So how they died, and their influence is just locally. Meanwhile, their other, if she'd stayed there, they might have been able to kill her future babies or inflicted pain on her. But she abandons the problem and leaves it up to the Corinthians to resolve one way or the other.
Well, okay, it doesn't look good for Medea's character.
Well, and, you know, that's another argument, which we don't need to get in here unless it's important later. As you look at the story that we know of her from all the texts and all the myths, she is not a good person. After betraying her father and dicing up her brother and convincing the daughters of Peleus to dice him up, then killing the princess, it seems really unlikely that the final act in her story in the Western world is to immortalize her children. Seems to be more likely she diced them up on the altar to have the magical power to summon the solar chariot. I mean, just the last thing she does is thinks to immortalize her children, all the other nasty stuff she did to people. Seems out of character.
You know, this is such a series of great points, and even the last word, character, you know, we could have a big debate about. Are these Athenian tragic types in any sense kind of psychologically authentic characters? I think they are characters pushed to the extreme, like women on the verge of a nervous breakdown in some cases, or men who are just losing it, like Oedipus in other cases. But I agree. I mean, from our mortal standpoint, Medea is no Mother Teresa. Let's put it that way. That's what makes her good to think with. But there's at least two other things that I think we do have to think of in relation to Athens, because you mentioned, you know, this is like a local problem, right? Otherwise, the Corinthian women have stillbirths. You know, that's the kind of local problem. Medea goes to Athens. So she's got that connection. And there she almost kills the Athenian hero, Theseus, but she takes off again because she's discovered by various means. And where does she go? She flees with her son, yet another son she seems to have had. And in some cases, he's the son with an Athenian, Aegeus. She flees to what is now Persia, and her son's name was Medos, and the Medes get named after him. So in a very weird way, Medea is like the mother of the Persians. And I think that might explain why she doesn't come across well. She's the kind of beginning of evils, if you're thinking from a 5th century Athenian standpoint. So I think it's worthwhile to think of the myth as being very localized, but it's got two localities that are important, Athens and Corinth. Does that make sense? That, you know, I'm adding to the dossier of bad stuff for Medea. She's basically the one that if we didn't have Medea and Medos, we wouldn't have the Medes, and we wouldn't have the Persian War eventually.
Yeah, I like that addition to a resume.
Stephen is a spirit from.
Oh, sorry. George, go ahead.
Sorry, may I have a moment, please, before I disappear in the void here? I'm sorry, my circumstances are a bit. I want to say, very interesting, and the compilations very inspiring. Just the one thing mentioned to be the history being the goddess in the list of the modern
I'm afraid I'm not. It's going in and out.
Yeah, we might have to come back to your question, Georgia. If you can type it into the chat bar.
I'm sorry. I tried again. The thing is very long. Just is it now? Do you hear me now? Just be.
Yeah, we can hear you okay right now. Go ahead.
Okay, just I have about the technical problems. Hesiod's version, or Hesiod's, it's the mentioning of Medea in the list of goddesses having relationship with mortal man, having then the children being mortal. One mortal is enough for the line of immortal to break. So then Hera, having to immortalize as returning of the favor for not being seduced or seduce Zeus. So one thing. So Euripides, had to go miles, kind of some miles, to have his version. It's 431 Eastern War. Some historiography said it's important to understand when it's really perhaps representative to think what Euripides might think might be that, but rather it's more in order from Euripides. So it is, the point. I mean, the tragedy is, as by many, is considered to have, the question: what is now the consequence of enormous violence, of barbarous actions? The consequence is more barbarous actions, more violent actions.
Can I respond a little bit?
Yes.
No, I'm just going to say that's a very Aeschylean and very interesting view of this kind of chain, which goes back to all kinds of original violence, maybe even pre-Olympian. If you think of the heritage of Medea herself, the genealogy. Whose grandfather is the sun. So, and the sun, on the other hand, is a kind of emblem of a certain kind of justice. I'm thinking of the sun and the cattle of the sun in the Odyssey, and the way in which the sun sees everything that happens in the story of the rape of Persephone, and he's the one who can sort of direct you to justice. So, as an Aeschylus, what eventually gets worked out very violently is a kind of rough justice. Well, certainly Medea would put it that way. It's all about Dike and Themis and justice coming back to get Jason because of what he did with the oaths that he swore. Now, what we can try to unpack later is whether that's really just a kind of excuse on her part, and she's just burning with jealousy and anger, or whether she really is a kind of instrument of justice of the gods coming to get the guy who violated the oaths. What I would like to do now is simply turn to the last bit of evidence quickly. You don't have to read everything, and then open the floor to the questions of whether possible heroine status or goddess status, or both, influence the audience. So here's the evidence of Medea in cult herself, not necessarily just the children. Pausanias, in another bit, says that Medea carried each child as they were born to the sanctuary of Hera and concealed them, thinking that they would be immortal. Let's just put that on hold for a moment as we looked at the Suda under the word for goat, ikes. There's a proverb, the nanny goat giving the knife, because as the Corinthians were sacrificing to Hera Acraia, whose cult Medea is said to have established, the mercenaries hiding the knife in the nearby earth claimed that they had forgotten it, but the goat dug it up with her feet. Okay, totally incidental story, but it's got the bit about Medea herself establishing cult. She establishes cult. Is that somehow connected to the above, the sanctuary of Hera, and her attempt to immortalize the children by, quote, concealing them? Let's look at a few more things about Medea and cult. If
you go one, yeah, there we go.
Yeah, thank you. Yet another scholiast, this time to Pindar. And this time, check out who brings an end to the famine. Medea, when she lived in Corinth, epauser Corinthius limo catechomenus. So Medea brought an end to the famine by sacrificing to Demeter and the Lemnian nymphs. Then Zeus falls in love with her, Medea, but he didn't win Medea because she wanted to avoid the anger of Hera. So she's a kind of upholder of the sanctity of marriage, of Hera's rights. Because of this, Hera promised that she would make Medea's children immortal. And the Corinthians honor them after their deaths, calling them, weirdly, mixobarbarus, semi-barbarians. Lots of weird stuff going on there, but the main point is Medea establishes, brings about the end of the famine. I would connect that with the earlier bit about Medea establishing the cult. So Medea is a kind of stand-in for Hera here. And the reciprocity is that Hera is going to make the children immortal, which we know from the other bit Medea herself is trying to do. I think this is a different view of Medea as having agency. It's not her killing the children, but her in a much broader frame, acting like an agent of Hera, either as a heroine or a goddess. Often these hero figures do establish cult. And part of the syndrome is they become the object of cult, but they also are kind of Johnny Appleseed-like, bringing cult to other places. And finally, because I think this is yet another bit that brings together Hera, Medea, and the children. When the children were born, she concealed the newborn katakryptein, bringing it to the sanctuary, thinking that the concealing would make them immortal. There's a discussion as to whether concealing means killing, or whether concealing is more like an initiation rite here. Finally, she learned that her hope was in vain. She was detected by Jason. He didn't forgive her. He sailed away. Medea went away. And this happens to be very old stuff because it comes from Eumelos, who is writing Corinthian epics possibly as early as 700 BC. So one more, and then I'll leave with some questions. This is Corinne Pasch talking about that specific part, and this is from her book on baby heroes. She thinks that katakryptein does refer to hiding and concealing in an initiatory context, reminiscent of myths about immortalizing. And she happens to bring in Demeter and Achilles himself. It's interesting that Achilles, who's going to get married to Medea in the other world, was the object of a Medea-like immortalization attempt, according to the story. But what I'm interested in is that set of Thetis and Demeter and Medea. These are all three mother figures. Demeter is a nanny, Thetis is the mother, Medea is a mother. Mother figures who attempt to immortalize children, and each one of them is somehow foiled. Does the fact that Medea can be inserted into that multiform set, Demeter, goddess, Thetis, goddess, Medea, question mark, goddess, or heroine, does that affect the way we view her in the poem of Euripides? And my suggestion, to cut to the chase, is that yes, if you see Medea as a heroine in the real ritual sense, somebody whose anger is useful because the anger gets at your enemies and can be used for helping the community, then the overwhelming presence of Medea's anger and her meanness in Euripides is an important signal to the audience that everything you see in the kind of mortal psychological story of Medea might have a divine dispensation, recommendation, etiological explanation. So let me leave it at that, and you can tell me your impression, whether you think this makes a difference to reading the drama.
You know, I think if you look at Medea as a goddess, it explains why the Erinyes were never chasing after her. It explains why she seems to get away with all this stuff, because the gods live outside of our paradigm in a different world of their own. So a lot of the inconsistencies in the story that we would wonder about is explained by the notion that she's a goddess.
That makes me think of how Jason says, I know why this evil is happening to me. It's because you're being chased by the, I mean, he doesn't say you're being chased by the Furies. He does say avenging spirit, I think. You killed your brother, and that avenging spirit, you know, you brought it with you. I'm not quite sure how to integrate that, but just what you said, Bill, about the Furies, made me think of it.
I think the frustrating thing is she sort of hovers like a holographic portrait between goddess and mortal, which of course is precisely the status of the heroine. So again, I'm not saying we have a smoking gun that she's a heroine in the really ritual sense, but all of the indicators point that way. I would point out the places where she is called dus menes, you know, having a bad spirit or having bad power. She is called somebody who's not yet apios, who's not yet gentle. And that reminds me of what the Corinthians try to do to make gentle melisontai, the kids. She's etimasmene without time, and time is what you offer to heroes and heroinae in the ground. And then the whole thing about Aegeus, you know, the Aegeus scene is a supplication, but it reminds me a lot of Oedipus at Colonus. So it might be a fun experiment to go back and read Oedipus at Colonus after having read the Medea. Medea being welcomed into the land of Athens by Aegeus, it looks a lot like the other scenario.
I was interested in that close connection with Hera, and I was reminded of the story of the priestess of Hera and her sons Cleobis and Biton, and wanting to preserve that one perfect moment where they die but become part of a cult. And I know it's a very different scenario, but perhaps a nicer spin on Medea perhaps killing her children could be preserving them in some way. So, and all those evidence you've given of attempted immortalization seems to be, there seems to be some sort of similarities maybe.
I think that's a wonderful analogy. I hadn't thought about that at all, but you know, it fits. Mother causes death of children who get immortalized in the sanctuary of Hera. The mother of Cleobis and Biton doesn't do it on purpose, but they have to drag her like they're mules or chariot horses, and that's what kills them off. So I think it's a really great analogy, and what it's trying to say is, I think, puzzling to us, but it is a sort of hopeful analogy that even the death of children, if done in the framework of worship of Hera, is somehow compensated.
And Medea does have some success, according to some stories, in killing people and bringing them back to life, not immortalizing them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, she can do it when she wants to. And then if it happens to be, you know, Pelias, well, she forgets to add the secret sauce at the end and he doesn't make it back, but she can do it to goats and other animals. Yeah.
So her Aunt Circe is kind of the same middle ground between daemon and goddess. Have you looked at comparisons there?
No, I haven't. And I think that's the natural way to go. I would also have to follow up on Greg Crane's work and push into the Near East. And it's interesting that these are people who come from the land of the rising sun. I think Greg has found parallels, Greg Crane, between Circe and people like Ishtar and Inanna. So I think there's a lot going on underneath the ground there. It's not probably even totally a Greek thing. Even connecting them to the sun and knowing Greek beliefs about, the kind of eternal return of the sun and its relationship to souls coming back to life, you can see this as part of a much bigger kind of resurrection story.
I must say, my first impression, Richard, I love all of these passages you brought together, especially the earlier ones that show a much more august and worthy, magnificent character, Pindar in Pythian 4 and Olympian 13 rather briefly, but still, presents this august character, not a mean, demoniacal child killer. So I think Euripides has done a pretty drastic makeover of the traditional Medea. We're looking at Eumelus and Pindar and Pausanias.
Yeah, and I think thanks. It again reminds us that Athenian drama is really a local phenomenon. As although it made it universally, maybe this is a really Athenian take on the godmother of the Medes, of the Persians. And as we know, other people in Greece were not that disturbed by the Persians, like the Thebans, who Medized.
I see a comment from Anne here, I think on the possible divinity of Medea, noting that she flies away in a chariot drawn by serpents, which is not something ordinary people can do. Other semi-gods have been transported in chariots drawn by supernatural beings. She has success in doing that, whereas it occurs to me someone like Phaethon doesn't do a good job of driving his magical chariot.
Yeah. And she knows how to drive. It's interesting that the driving chariot motif, which we talked about in Cleobus and Biton, comes up in yet another connection. And this also reminds me of what happens in the Bacchae, as much as we can tell from the kind of fractured ending of Euripides' Bacchae, where Cadmus and Harmonia apparently will be taking the form of serpents as they move on from Thebes. So is this a heroine thing or is it a goddess thing? Snakes, I think, might be the key. And snakes are definitely chthonic intermediaries because they know how to tunnel into the earth in Greek imagination, and the kind of intermediary between the two spheres. Otherwise, I don't think snakes have a whole lot to do with the sun. That's always bothered me. Why a chariot drawn by serpents?
Well, Copperhead sure loved to sit out on rocks, lie out on rocks in the sun.
Yeah, so do I. Therefore,
I think Medea was a priestess of Hecate, so that might have the snake connection there.
Yes, that's right. She refers to that in the play. She says at line 395 following, well, I'm a Hecate worshiper. She's my favorite goddess. Not a good sign. But so she's got an underworld connection there.
Speaking of heroic imagery, Medea accepts the label or what have you of lion. We've seen lots of lions on heroes' shields and in front of their tombs and things. Jason calls her a lion and compares her to Scylla.
Yes. So, another thing I thought might be an objection is that, yes, she has these powerful connections. Lions are a great example. Isn't that because she is taking over hero status, not heroine status? And Berta Knox long ago wrote about both Ajax and Medea, that they are figures of the hero in a kind of gender-bending, transgressive way. So maybe we shouldn't rule that out either, that she's sort of symbolically, imagistically intruding on that territory. She's not Iphigenia, in other words. A lot of heroines get pushed around, literally, carted around like Iphigenia, but she's not like that. She does the moving.
No, with Iphigenia, we're back to she was sacrificing strangers to Artemis.
Yeah, and she was a near sacrificee herself. She would be like the child killed by the parent, except for Artemis intervening. So there is that kind of both ends of the spectrum.
Right. Good.
You have to have been there in order to really experience it, but then the goddess makes you do it for other people. I get the sense that there is some kind of tie-in amongst these child-killing stories.
Is it always barbarians?
Well, it's funny that the kids are mixobarbarus. Even the children of Medea are this kind of hybrid. Now, does that express this sort of hybridization of goddess and mortal? Or is it another Athenian obsession? Because we know the Athenians were crazy about defining the other.
Right.
I don't know. Do you ever have, we'll put it this way, do you ever have in Greek myth purely Greek child killing, well, Agamemnon? But then you would say, well, Agamemnon's ultimate ancestor, Pelops, comes from Lydia. So.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Great. Any other questions? We should probably wrap it up here. We've gone over our hour without, well, I haven't noticed anyway.
Well, it's so much fun.
All right. Thanks, Richard, again for joining us.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, gang. It's great to see the Theasos in action, as always. I love it.
All right. Bye to you all.
Good luck. Goodbye. Have a good day.